Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, thumbs up, thumbs down. Today we are going into the trial and hearing of Tom Carney, a ex-rugby player from Swansea who murdered a 76-year-old predator. It's going to be quite a road. At the end, there's going to be the transcripts from the actual court case. So, hope you enjoy and let's get on to it. Violent past of killer Tom Carney and the long history of sexual offending of his victims. Former rugby player Tom Carney threw his life away and was convicted of repeatedly violent offences, while the man he murdered had a record of predatory sexual offending against young men going back 3 decades. Yeah, not someone I'd want to meet in a dark alley or a friggin' light one, to be fair, but I digress. A killer who has thrown away his career as a rugby player and faces life in jail had multiple previous convictions for violence. Tom Carney, 29, repeatedly stamped on 76-year-old David Phillips' head on Valentine's Day in 2019 after going to his victim's Neath home to exchange sexual favours for alcohol. Okay. The 29-year-old was on Thursday found guilty of murdering following the trial at Swansea Crown Court, lasting almost 3 weeks. While the one-time promising sportsman latest offended is under question, the most serious is far from his first. During the trial, prosecution Patrick Hamilton told the jury, "The fact is, Thomas Carney has thrown his life away, thrown away a career as a rugby player where he could have achieved great things. He has discomfort in knowing he is one of those that might have been." Wow. So this is sort of going into his criminal history of like what he's done, his background is. So the killer has 5 offences on records. In 2012, at Swansea's Magistrates Court, convicted of common assault. Common assault is probably the lowest out of the assaults. Carney became involved in an altercation in Swansea's Oceana nightclub before attacking a man. In 2016, Swansea's Magistrate Courts convicted assault of beating. Carney attacked a member of staff at a shop in Pontawyd after stealing 3 bottles of wine. Okay, so magistrates, we have magistrates and Crown Court here. Magistrates, they don't give anything but a few months in jail, maybe like up to, I think, sort of 18-month mark. They are just, is no jury, it's just in front of a judge. It's a something and nothing. Then when your crimes become worse or you become a offender who keeps offending for violent offences, they will then go from magistrates up to the Crown. June 2018, Swansea magistrates again, court convicted of assaulting a constable, so he attacked a copper. Carney repeatedly kicked the police officer in the leg at Swansea Central Police Station after being arrested. Well, clearly he didn't want to be arrested. August, again, 2018, Swansea magistrates convicted of assault by beating. Carney punched a man in the face in Gwen Arms in Altwyn. See, we're still in magistrates. 2019, Swansea Magistrates Court convicted him of assault again by beating, smashing a glass in his victim's head at the address in ABOVE.AND. Carney has previously been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which it can be reported for the first time, he says, It is a result of a sexual abuse he suffered as a boy between the ages of 5 and 9. The person he named as his abuser denies the abuse ever happened. For legal reasons, we are unable to report the details until now. Well, Carney was no stranger to the courts. His pensioner victim had a long history of predatory behaviour towards young men. At the time of his death, Mr. Phillips was subject to a sexual harm prevention order. I don't know what one of those is, but I will look. At the time, having sexually assaulted a boy in Neath Town Centre in 2016, and his history of sexual offending goes over 30 years. If it goes over 30 years, why isn't he in jail? Okay, so in 1991, Swansea Crown Court convicted of sexual assault, indecent assault and gross indecency. Philip piled a 15-year-old boy with intoxicants before sexually assaulting him. 1999, Swansea Crown Court convicted of assault with intending serious sexual assault and indecent assault. Philip met a man at a bar in Swansea and brought him drinks before taking him home. He gave his victim a quantity of tablets which made him drowsy before performing oral sex on him, attempting to penetrate him. 2016, Swansea Crown Court convicted of sexual assault after meeting an 18-year-old man at a bus stop. He persuaded the teenager to go home with him on the pretense he needed work doing. Once at the house, Phillips gave the teen alcohol, kissed him and put his hand down his trousers. 2016, Swansea Crown Court convicted of sexual assault after buying goods from a shop in Neath. He asked the 16-year-old male shop assistant to help him carry them to his taxi, then hugged the boy, made sexual comments and tried to entice him back to his house. So that's a bit of the background of these two who are involved in this case. So let's get on to this bit. Former youth player convicted of murder, pensioner in attack of savagery. Tom Carvey has been found guilty of murdering pensioner David Williams, whose body was found at his home in Neath on Valentine's Day. Tom Carney is accused of murdering pensioner David Phillips at his home in Lime Grove in the Simlin area of Neath. One-time talented rugby player has been convicted of murdering a pensioner in a killer driven by rage, revenge and spite. A former Ospreys youth player, Tom Carvey, was behind a vicious, sustained and brutal attack on pensioner David Phillips. Juries were told before they retired to consider their verdict at around noon on Wednesday. The body of 76-year-old Phillips was found in the home in Lime Grove in the Neath area on Valentine's Day 2019. He had suffered catastrophic injuries to his head and chest. Now, okay, not that he wasn't a pensioner, he was a pensioner, but they're making him like he's this innocent pensioner in this one, and we know from previous that he isn't this innocent pensioner. This isn't, I don't know. Let's carry on. Carney murdered the pensioner by repeatedly stamping on his head in a violent rage. The 29-year-old denied murder but admitted manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. On Tuesday, his trial at Swansea Crown Court heard closing speeches from both the prosecution and defendant's barrister ahead of the jury being sent out to consider the verdict. Prosecutions, as alleged, Carney agreed to go with Mr. Phillips' flat to perform sexual favours in return for alcohol. Prosecution Patrick Harrington, QC, opened his speech by telling the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is murder. Thomas Carney deliberately inflicted the most vicious, sustained and brutal attack on his victim and by so doing, in a controlled manner and fueled by anger, chose to end another person's life. Mr. Harrington added he does not seem to accept his culpabilities, seeing himself more as a victim than a killer. He is a killer. He has only admitted what he has been proved anyway. It's kind of true. Carney maintained that Mr. Phillips was his sponsor at Alcoholics Anonymous and had offered him to help him after his relapse by weaning him off alcohol. The defendant said that once he had got into Mr. Phillips' flat, he abused his trust and drugged and raped him. By the jury rejecting that explanation on Thursday afternoon, Carney of Leicester Morriston was found guilty of murder. He will be sentenced next week. Carney's trial heard that on the evening of the killing, Carney took a taxi from his home to Mr. Phillips' home in exchange for sexual favours for the nature of drink. Now, that doesn't make sense. If he needed drink, why didn't he just use his taxi money? Okay. Mr. Harrington said both men drank alcohol before Carney left the property, only to return shortly after in a violent rage and smashed his way through the front door with a concrete garden ornament. Mr. Harrington said he was to open the prosecution's case that once back inside the ground floor flat, Carney subjected Mr. Phillips to an attack, the savage of which was almost unbelievable. Some of this assault was witnessed through the window by a neighbour after her attention had been drawn by the noise. She described seeing the defendant repeatedly stamping and jumping on Mr. Phillips's head. While the neighbour was on the phone to police, Carney fled the flat, and people nearby reported seeing him in an agitated state, shouting that somebody had tried to rape him. The defendant was later found by police in the garden a few streets away and repeated that claim that Mr. Phillips had tried to rape him to the officers.
Come here a minute, alright? What's your name? What's your name? What's your name, buddy? Jeremy, listen, I'm going to have to cuff you a minute and then we'll chat to you, alright? Alright?
For what, though?
Jeremy, let me cuff you and then we'll talk to you, alright? Alright, you're on camera. Alright, take care, we're going to look after you, alright?
You shouldn't rape me.
Rape me. Alright, buddy. Something
No,
else.
I'm not, unless you give me a cigarette.
Come out with me now.
I'm being serious, I'll smack you for shooting the face now. I got the cuffs on. I want a cigarette first.
He subsequently told the police doctor who examined him that the pensioner had performed oral sex on him and then had asked for a whatever that's supposed to be. Mr. Harrington also told the jury that the victim was a seriously flawed individual who had appeared in court 3 times charged with serious sexual offences, but said nothing could justify what the defendant had done to him. The prosecution told the jury about the neighbour of Mr. Phillips. Ellery Davis said she described how he had been at the home on the night in question when she heard very loud banging, describing the sound like a ram raid. The neighbour went outside and saw the man smashing his way through Mr. Phillips's front door. The court heard she approached her neighbour's flat and thought the front door window saw a horrible attack taking place. Mr. Harrington said she saw the defendant going mad and saw him throwing all the items of furniture. She saw him repeatedly stamping down on what was Mr. Phillips' head. He repeatedly jumped up and down and stamped with both feet. Her words were, "He pulverized him. He appeared he must have been on something. It was pure rage." Richard Jones, at Home Office forensic pathologist, told the trial, visited the property the following day and saw the body of the deceased laying on the floor in the front room. He noted his head was grossly distorted. At the left side of his face was flattened. Dr. Jones told the jury that subsequent CT scans at the University Hospital of Wales showed there had effectively been a shatter of the facial bone, meaning the face had lost its integrity. Oh my goodness. And this would have caused uncontrollable bleeding in the airways, and he would be left unable to breathe. The pathologist told the jury that he had also found broken bones in Mr. Phillips' neck, a fracture to his spine, and 27 rib fractures and bruising to the genitals and pelvic area, the pattern of which suggested focused, blunt impact and impact to the genitals. So we have some transcripts from the court, which I will go over. There is quite a bit, so it's going to take a little bit of time, so you don't have to obviously stay around for this part, but it's sort of interesting. It goes into a bit of detail. Jury selection at present takes no longer than it used to be because it needs to be corona social distancing measures to the court. Case to begin shortly. Welcome to our coverage of the trial of Thomas Carney, who is accused of murdering 76-year-old David Phillips in his home in Neath. This morning, the court heard legal submissions and went through the process of jury selection. 14 people were sworn in to serve on the jury, and 2 alternates will listen to the prosecution opening of the case this afternoon, then will be discharged to leave jury of 12. This is a precaution in case any matters dropped up during the opening, which means one of the juries have to be withdrawn. Prosecution Patrick Harrington QC begins his opening telling the jury, on Thursday, February 13th, 2019, almost 2 years ago now, a brutal murder took place in the Sinlan area of Neath when this defendant, Thomas Carney, attacked and killed a man by the name of David Phillips. The defendant was not an intruder into the home of Mr. Phillips because he was, despite desperate for alcohol, he went there to exchange favours of a sexual nature for drink. Despite Patrick Harrington trying to tell the jury that it is not disputed that Carney was responsible for killing Mr. Phillips, the issue is whether he is guilty of a crime of murder or of manslaughter. He says the issue is Carney's psychiatric condition when he committed the killing. Patrick Harrington tells the jurors that after spending the evening on February 14th, 2019, drinking together in Mr. Phillips's flat, Carney left the property for a period before returning. He says the defendant then chose to go back, smash his way through the front door. It is thought that it was with a concrete ornament in a violent rage. Mr. Harrington added, the savagery of followed was almost unbelievable. Prosecution Patrick Harrington, why do these bloody QCs always have the most horrific names to say, tells the jury that prosecutions does not try to hide from the fact that the victim, David Phillips, was a seriously flawed individual, that's one way of saying it, who had appeared in court 3 times for a series of sexual offences. The court hears at around 8:25 p.m. on the day in question, Carney took a taxi from his home in Morriston to Kilmer? I'm probably saying that wrong. It's in Neath. The taxi driver described Carney as being polite and sober. When the cabbie asked if he needed to stop at the bank machine to get cash, the defendant said, "No, my friend is paying at the other end." The prosecution says Carney held his phone up so Mr. Phillips could give the taxi driver directions to his house, but the cabbie had different understanding him because he was slurring his words, so he was already wasted. The court heard during the journey Carney was talking about his girlfriend Katie Pryor, with whom he had spent the previous night with. The jury heard the taxi carrier, the defendant, initially stopped at Pine Grove instead of Lime Grove by mistake. Carney went to the house on the street and asked the homeowner if he was Dave. Carney was then given directions to nearby Lime Street and the car went there. Prosecution Patrick Harrington says the cabbie dropped Carney off at the right address and he was paid by Mr. Phillips. The taxi driver would later describe Mr. Phillips as being scruffily dressed and wasted, but said the pair appeared to know each other and was in. Prosecution Patrick Harrington QC is now telling the jury about the neighbour of Mr. Phillips, Ellery Davis, and said she described how he had been at home on the night in question when she heard a very loud banging. She described sounding like a ram raid. The neighbour went outside and saw a man smashing his way through Mr. Phillips's door. The court hears she approached the neighbour's flat and saw through the front room window a horrific attack taking place. Mr. Harrington says she saw the defendant going mad. She saw him throwing all the items of furniture. She saw him repeatedly stomping down. He went to stomp on Mr. Phillips' head. He repeatedly jumped up and down, simultaneously stomping with both feet. Her words were, he pulverized him. He appeared to her he must have been on something. It was pure rage. Jury played 999 call made by neighbour. Prosecution Patrick Harrington told the jury Ellery, I don't know how to say her name, Davis, Miss Davis, saw the neighbour David Phillips laying on the floor on his back. He was wearing a dressing gown which was open in the front. She saw Mr. Phillips's face was covered in blood. The barrister says the neighbours shouted at Carney to stop, which point he looked at her and began shouting and swearing at her. Mr. Harrington says the look was such as she had feared for her safety. The woman retracted to her own flat and called 999. The jury is now being played the 999 call Mrs. Davis made to the police at 9:16 p.m. in which she told the operator of what she had seen. In the call, the neighbour described how she saw Mr. Phillips being attacked in his flat, saying somebody was hitting the hell out of him and how the victim was in a quote-unquote real mess. The court hears what on the 999 call neighbour Mrs. Davis told by another neighbour that the attacker had left Mr. Phillips's flat. She went to Mr. Phillips's flat and saw him laying on the floor and his chest was moving slightly. Miss Davis left again, only to return a few minutes later, but by the time Mr. Phillips's head was enlarged, his chest was not moving, and it was clear he was dead. Carney took onlookers and told onlookers someone had tried to rape him. Prosecution Patrick Harrington QC tells the court that while this was happening at the victim's flat, a number of people living in the neighbouring streets reported seeing an agitated Carney walking around. The court hears he told a number of witnesses that he had tried to rape him. The defendant then borrowed a phone off one of the neighbours and rang his dad and asked him to come and collect him. The barrister said Mr. Carney Sr. did go to collect his son. By the time he had arrived, police already located and arrested the defendant. The jury is now hearing about and being shown body cam footage from the police officer who first arrived at David Phillips' flat. Prosecution Patrick Harrington TC says the PC found the victim laying on the floor in the front room. His head was purple and swollen, and obvious signs of trauma. His chest was not moving. One of the PCs nonetheless began CPR chest compressions, though with no response. Paramedics arrived and they could find no pulse and no breathing. Paramedic Andrew Ashdown fitted a cardio monitor to the Mr. Phillips, but there was no sign of a heartbeat to be detected. Life was pronounced exist at 9:39. So that was 8 minutes after the 999 call. Defendant became aggressive while in custody. The jury is now being shown the body cam footage of Carney arrested in a garden a few streets away from where Mr. Phillips's flat is. The defendant is again heard to allege that David Phillips had tried to rape him. Carney is handcuffed and put in the back of a police van. When the officer told that Mr. Phillips had died, they arrest the defendant on suspicion of murder, to which point he breaks down. The court hears that Swansea Central Police Station. Carney subsequently became aggressive and abusive to the officers, shouting, swearing and spitting in the face of one of the officers. I think that was in front of the custody sarge. He later had to be forced into a cell where he urinated over himself and refused to move his clothes for examination, meaning they were cut off him. Mr. Harrington tells the court that Carney has already pleaded guilty to assaulting an emergency worker in relation to his reprehensible behaviour at the police station. The barrister tells the court it is accepted that Carney has left his phone in Mr. Phillips's flat when he left the first time. He could have gone home without it. Instead, he decided to return. Nothing justifies going back to the flat and committing homicide. Carney said he drank 60 units of alcohol that day. Prosecution Patrick Harrington QC resumes his opening. He tells the court that Carney was examined by a doctor known as the Force Medical Examiner, or FME, at lunchtime on February the 15th. He says the medic found Carney to be cooperative and coherent if anxious. The barrister says Carney disclosed a history of emotional unstable personality disorder for which he is taking medicine, and discloses that he drank 60 units of alcohol a day, as well as being on a regular user of cannabis. He also said he smoked 40 cigarettes a day and infrequently took amphetamines, cocaine and intravenous heroin. The court heard the defendant told the doctor that on the night in question, Mr. Phillips had performed oral sex on him and then asked him for a... Carney also told the medic, "I don't want to, but I needed the alcohol. But when Mr. Phillips asked for full sex, I felt I couldn't go any further." Judge explains distinction between murder and manslaughter, Judge Paul Thomas, QC, is now explaining to the jury the difference between murder and manslaughter, and what they must decide upon is coming to the decision. In this case, Carney is arguing what is known as diminished responsibility. The judge tells the members of the jury that if it comes up to Carney to show on the balance of probabilities that at the time of the incident he was suffering from an abnormality of mental function, as such, an ability arose from the recognized medical condition, as opposed to, for example, being caused by voluntary consumption of alcohol and or drugs, and that such an abnormality substantially impaired, Christ, that's a mouthful, his ability to rationally judgment, and such the abilities to provide the explanation. Yeah, good luck with that, jury, because that's just insane. Jury is now being told about a forensic examination of David Phillips's flat and the patterns of blood spatter found in the room, including the arc of blood. Some 2/3 of the circle, and the blood was later identified as coming from the deceased. The jury is also told that the blood was found on the stereo system in the room, and that it had been used to strike Mr. Phillips at least twice. Holy shit, he went on a rampage. That concludes the prosecution's opening for today. Mr. Harrington will resume the opening tomorrow morning. Day 2 of the trial begins shortly. Welcome to our coverage of the second day of Thomas Carney's, my God, I can't even speak today, Carney's trial. The courtroom at Swansea Crown Court, Court 1, was used for sentencing hearing first thing this morning and is now being cleaned as part of the coronavirus procedures. The prosecution is defence barrister will be coming into the court shortly. The judge, His Honour Paul Thomas QC, the prosecution barrister Patrick Harrington QC, the defence barrister David Ellis QC, are now in court. The jury have been sent for and the trial will resume shortly. This morning, the prosecution will continue their opening against the defendant. Prosecuting barrister Patrick Harrington QC began by describing what a forensic investigator found when he went to David Phillips' flat on the night he died. He says that some of the furniture in the bedroom had been disturbed and there were signs of an incident or struggle in the room, but no blood was present. The front room is where Mr. Phillips' body was found, which was being used as a study, had patterns of blood splatter which indicated that none of the blows the victim sustained were inflicted while he was in a standing position. It seems like the fatal injuries were delivered as he was laying defenceless on his back on the floor, says Mr. Harrington. The court hears the investigator found evidence of multiple blows delivered to Mr. Phillips's head. The jury hears about bloody footprints that were found at the scene, and blood matching the victims was found on the sole of the defendant's trainers. Prosecuting Patrick Harrington said the blood had been forced into the trends of his shoes, and such findings was typical of stamping on the victim. Mr. Harrison says that the carpet under Mr. Phillips's head was soaked in blood. The prosecution is now telling the jury about the visit at the Home Office pathologist Richard Jones to the victim's flat. He says the doctor found Mr. Phillips laying on his back, dressed in a dressing gown which was open at the waist. The victim's head was so grossly misformed and 3 of his teeth had been knocked out, which gives the indication of forced use. Do you think? The barrister says swabs and samples were taken from the body. He says the post-mortem examination of the body revealed multiple fractures to Mr. Phillips's nose, cheeks, jaw, the jury now being shown 3D images of the victim's skull. Prosecution Patrick Harrington, QC, says medical concludes David Phillips had suffered significant destruction of a facial bone, as well as complete fractures to the top of his spine, fractures through his chest bone, complete rib fractures, fractures to the bones of his pelvic area, and fractures to the bone in his neck, as well as damaged cartilage, and total of 27 fractures to the ribs. Holy shit. He says it was blindly obvious to the medics that the injuries that were caused by blunt force trauma, consistent with an assault cause of death, was given as blunt force trauma injuries to the head, neck, and chest. The jury is now looking at an aerial photo of the street around Mr. Phillips's flat, taken by a drone. Various locations are marked on the picture, including 17 Lime Street, the victim's address, as well as the nearby houses in Pine Grove, where Carney mistakenly went in a taxi. A number of the house, which was the defendants, went into the moment after the fatal attack. The garden was found. He was found in a garden by the police. The pair met at an AA meeting. The jury had been taken through a log showing the phone contact between Carney and Mr. Phillips in the weeks before the killing. The pair had met at an AA meeting and exchanged numbers. The court hears the exchange between January 18th are a mix of calls, the context of which are unknown, obviously. The text messages have been retrieved, and the messages of the pair discussing AA meetings and Mr. Phillips also expressing his concern for his new friend. In one message, Mr. Phillips says, Carney is so much in my thoughts and prayers, and one he signs off, love you, your Dave. Prosecution barrister Patrick Harrington says the tone of the content of the texts suggests Mr. Phillips was well disposed to Carney. Mr. Harrington tells the jury that in the early evening of February 14th, the day of the killing, Mr. Phillips had 2 long calls to Carney of 29 and 16 minutes in length. He says they were setting the scene for Carney to visit. At 6:58 p.m, Carney called a cab company and booked a ride to Neath. At 8:08, he texts Mr. Phillips to say on way. Mr. Harrington says the text was signed with a kiss or at least an X. Now, I don't think that's much to go by. A lot in the UK, boys and girls sign off with an X. It's not anything to sort of go by, but whatever. There were further calls from Carney to Mr. Phillips in quick succession, of which he was a passenger getting directions to Lime Grove. Prosecutor Patrick Harrington is continuing his opening. He says to the jury, why was he, Carney, went to Phillips' home broke with a drink problem. He decided to prostitute himself out to do homosexual gestures to Mr. Phillips. Before he killed Mr. Phillips, he left the premises. He could have gone home. Okay, he left his phone behind, but he could have borrowed one as he later did. He was a young, fit man. He could have walked home. I know it's a long way, but he probably known better who had walked that way when he had to. He decided, nobody else decided. He decided to smash his way into Mr. Phillips's home, kick and punch through the front door, and then he decided to kill him. His choice. He didn't have to go there. He chose to. He chose to go there, inflict the most appalling injuries on a man of 50 years old, 50 years older than him, and not in the best of health. He stomped up and down on the man's head as he lay on the ground. The members of the jury are now being taken through a large number of photographs shown at the scene of Mr. Phillips's flat, the aftermath of the assault. The barrister then tells they can refer pictures whenever they want to hear the evidence, which they do that often. They'll like number them and then say reference to picture A3, for example. Prosecutor Patrick Harrington tells the jury to give proper weight to the psychiatric evidence about Carney. They will hear the due course, but to put what they hear into context, not only of what happened in that flat, but also the defendant's subsequently behaviour at Swansea Central Police Station following his arrest, when he refused to get out of the police van without a cigarette. He spat in the face of the officers in the custody suite and fought with other officers. Oh my God. We saw the images and the footage of that. You know, they're going to restrain you. They're going to. He did not have to do anything. He chose to do what he did. A mature adult, physically fit. He chose to go to the home of a 76-year-old man. And when he left it, he decided to smash his way back in and kill Mr. Phillips, the man who had been so kind to him. Again, like, I'm so on the fence with this. They're making, you know, I get that, you know, Mr. Harrington is trying to put his case across, and I understand that, but putting it across in a way to make this Mr. Phillips sound like he was just so kind to him. Let's not forget what this bloke is or was. There will now be a short break before the first witness is called. Taxi driver called as first witness. The trial resumes after a short break, and the prosecution calls the first witness, Derek Scott, the taxi driver who drove Carney to Neath on the night in question. He says Carney got in the front passenger seat and asked him if he had the money for the fare or need to go to the cash machine. He says the passenger told him that the fare would be paid at the other end, and he took him at his word. The cabbie described the passenger as a polite young lad, as a thick-set fella, quite stocky. That's because he did steroids, but I digress. The witness says Carney talked about a woman he had spent the previous night with, and he asked if Carney was sober, and he said yeah, he wasn't drunk. The driver said Carney later helped a phone to his ear so that he could hear directions being given by the person at the other end. He says the person giving directions was wasted. Mr. Scott says that they initially went to what turned out to be the wrong address after a short conversation between Carney and the person in the house. They went to the correct address in Lime Grove. He says he was paid for the journey by the man at the property. Prosecutor Harrington QC asked, did Carney, seem to know the other person? The witness replied, yes, definitely. Mr. Scott says that they heard Carney ask the other man where they could get cheap booze. He agreed, Mr. Harrington, that the atmosphere between his passenger and the other man was pleasant. David Ellis, QC for the defendant, briefly cross-examined the taxi driver. He asked him to confirm Carney sat in the front seat of the cab, then initially went to the wrong address, and then Mr. Phillips was dressed in trousers with a shirt when he got to the correct address. Mr. Scott says he can't remember the shirt, but the trousers were a scruffy old pair. Okay, so he was dressed when he arrived. Why was he in a dressing gown? The jury is now being read evidence from a number of witnesses. The evidence is agreed by both prosecution and defendants, so they will not be called to give live evidence from the witness box. Their statements are being read by Ian Wright, the juror prosecution counsel. The first is from a taxi controller who took the booking over the phone from Carney. In the statement, she confirms the details of the call and says no specific address was given as a distinction and says the person is making the call was slurring his words. The second witness who evidence is being read is Robert Hughes. He is the occupant of the house in Pine Grove, which the taxi mistakenly went to. He says on the night in question, he was preparing a pizza for himself and his wife eating whilst watching the upcoming Death in Paradise episode on TV when the doorbell rang. When he answered the door and saw a man in a shirt, well-groomed, sandy hair on the doorstep, Mr. Hughes said he called, asked if he was Dave, and when he said he was not, the visitor appeared slightly taken aback. The caller then asked if the street was Lime Street, and the witness said that he told him that this was Pine Street and gave him directions. In his statement, he says because of the caller's demeanour, he was not concerned by the encounter. He says the caller then picked up 2-litre bottle of not clear liquid from a nearby boundary of a garden and got into a waiting taxi. What? He then picked up a not clear. That's weird. Mr. Hughes says that later that night he saw the blue flushed lights of police and cars on the estate, but thought nothing of it and assumed it must have been a car accident. I wonder what he picked up from the boundary of the garden and then got back into the car. So he must have put something in by the boundary of the garden, went and knocked the door, then picked it back up. That's bizarre. I hope it goes into more detail about what that is. The next witness to have their evidence read to the court is Jamie Corse. His partner Tony lives in the flat above Mr. Phillips. He says that when his partner moved in some 2 years prior to the incident, he became aware of various rumours about the man downstairs regarding him, quote unquote, taking young boys there. He says that the neighbour who had gone into the downstairs flat to help Mr. Phillips move furniture had repeatedly seen old used in the property. He also says he had heard voices of young men coming from the flat at various times and assumed they were occupants or his visitors were gay. The witness says whenever he had seen Mr. Phillips, he would say hello to the neighbour and was always intoxicated. The witness also described when he heard the evening of February 14th, he says he heard loud music, banging noises coming from downstairs flat, and later heard a voice that was not the occupant say F off several times, but to him it sounded more like banter than anything aggressive. He later said he heard the same voice, "You are effing taking the piss," in an annoyed way shortly before hearing a loud bang like a bookcase going over. The witness says he didn't see the incident, but just after 9 p.m, he and his partner were discussing getting a takeaway when he looked out of the window and saw the police car coming up the street and saw a female neighbour standing on the stairs outside the flat, clearly shocked. That concludes the morning's hearings, and the court will break for lunch and the trial will resume at 2:05 p.m. Next witness due to be called shortly. Welcome back to our coverage of the afternoon session in trial. The judge and legal teams are in the court. The jury has been sent for and will start shortly. The first witness will be Ellery Davis, the neighbour of the deceased who called 999 on the night of the attack, who is due to give evidence from home via a video link. Witness Ellery Davis tells the court that she and David Phillips had been neighbours in Neath for 7 years, and say they got on with one another. Prosecution David Hamilton said, did he have visitors to his home? The witness, he used to have people coming back and forth in taxis. in taxis young men. Apart from that, prosecution Patrick Harrington QC takes the witness Ellery Gray, a neighbour of the alleged murder victim David Phillips, to the evening of February 14th, 2019. The witness says she was watching TV when she heard a loud banging coming from outside the property. When she went to the door, she saw a man, quote-unquote, going through the door of her neighbour's flat. Miss Davis says she went to look through the window of Mr. Phillips's flat. The barrister asked what was going on. The witness replied it was pure rage. He had his hands on a table and chair and he was stomping down. Mr. Harrison say, could you see what he was stomping on? Miss Davis responded, no. Miss Davis said that she went into her neighbour's flat and saw the intruder going crazy. I shouted, boy, you're going to kill him. Leave him alone. What are you doing? You're going to kill him. She says Carney was raging on Dave. The witness says Mr. Phillips was laying on the floor, partially under the table. He was laying like a crucifix. Oh, good God. Mr. Harrington said, what was the man, Carney, doing to him? Pulverizing him, stamping on him. He had no face. Mr. Barrister says, Dave had no face? The witness replied, yes. Good God. So he was proper stamping on him. Witness Ellery Davis is now being cross-examined by David Ellis for Carney. He asked her about the defendant. What was he like when she went to the flat and the way she described him in her evidence. Mr. Ellis asks, you said he was going crazy. He was mad, wasn't he? The witness replied, raging. Mr. Ellis says, he'd lost it, hadn't he? Miss Davis replies, yes. The witness confirmed that she knew the deceased as David Davis and believed he was a doctor as he had a letter after his name. She says the once received a letter addressing MD David Davidson and gave it to her neighbour. Judge Thomas asked whether Mr. Phillips was in fact medically qualified. The prosecution said no, he was not. The jury played the 999 call Miss Davis made to the police and the body cam footage from the officers who spoke to the witnesses in the night in question. The next witness is Andrew Jones, another neighbour of the deceased. This evidence is in the form of a written statement and will be read by the juror by Junior Prosecution Counsel Ian Wright. He described being in the flat on the night in question when he heard his neighbour Ellery Davis, the previous witness, calling for him. He says he went outside and found Miss David upset, distraught and beside herself. He says he could hear repeated banging coming from the flat next to Miss Davis, like the sounds of someone stamping on the floor as a man repeatedly shouting like somebody was in a rage. Mr. Jones said he went to call a friend and Lime Grove neighbour Kevin Sterry. Together they approached the flat just as Carney was leaving. The witness says Carney had his fists clenched, appeared agitated, and like he did not know where he was. Mr. Jones said Carney looked pumped up, powerful and very strong. He says Carney asked for directions out of this area before walking off. Mr. Jones stated then he goes to the described what he saw when he and Mr. Sterry and Miss Davis entered the flat. He went to the front room and was smashed up. It looked like there had been a brawl in there. There was blood everywhere. I saw the body. The witness says there was such damage to Mr. Phillips's face that they did not recognize him. His face was purple, very swollen, with slits for eyeballs. He says his face looked like it had been punched in and his jaw was distorted, like it had been squashed. In this statement, he says Miss Davis and he were both checked for a pulse but could not find one. and the body had already started to go cold to the touch. Next witness called to give evidence. The next person to give evidence will be Kevin Sterry, the man previously witnessed Andrew Jones referred to in his statement. He will give evidence over a video link from another room in the building rather than coming into the court. In response to the question from the prosecution barrister Ian Wright, the witness tells the jury he was at home in Lime Grove playing on the Xbox game console with his son when Mr. Jones knocked on the door and asked him to accompany him. He tells the court the two men went into the flat where Mr. Jones lived, and they got to the block. A man who left the property. The court hears there was no dispute with this man is the accused. Mr. Sterry tells the court, Mr. Jones and I and a woman did not know, witness Ellery Davis, went to the flat. He says he was familiar with the layout of the flat as it's the same as his. In the front room of the flat, he says he saw a body on the floor with a CD player and loads of paperwork. Mr. Wright asked, it was obvious to you that the man was seriously injured? The witness replied, yes, it was. Witness Kevin Sterry is now being cross-examined by David Ellis QC for the defence. The barrister asked how close he got to the defendant, Tom Carney, outside the flats. The witness says he came within 2 meters of each other. Mr. Ellis asked, it was clear he had been drinking, was it? The witness replied, yes, it was. The barrister asked, that was from what you saw and from the smell of him, wasn't it? The witness replied, yes, it was. Judge Thomas asked the witness if he meant he could smell alcohol on the witness. He replied, yes. The jury is now being read short statements from two Neath police constables who were the first officers at the scene in response to the 999 call, PC David Harrell and Lindsay Archer. This concludes today's evidence. The trial will resume at 10:30 a.m. on Wednesday. The first witnesses to give evidence today is the Welsh Ambulance Service paramedic Andrew Ashdown, the first medic to arrive at Mr. Phillips's flat following the 999 call. He tells the call that at 9:22 on the night in question, he was to attend an unrelated incident when the control room diverted him to Lime Grove incident. He says he initially went there to carry out his role as a team leader supporting colleagues already at the flat, but in fact it turned out he was the first paramedic to arrive. Patrick Harrington, QC for the prosecution, asked the paramedic to describe what he saw and did at the flat. Andrew Ashdown says he entered the flat and saw a man laying on his back on the floor in the front room of the property. He says he was clear the person had suffered a traumatic injury to his face, disfigured, swollen and discoloured. He says he already knew the police on the scene had attempted CPR, chest compressions, and had checked for a pulse and for a sign of breathing. The paramedic said he attached a cardiac monitor to the man, but there was no electric activity from the heart. Mr. Ashdown says he became apparent that the resuscitation attempt was not viable, and he began the procedure to formally record life extinct. Defence barrister David Ellis says he has no questions for the witness. The next witness to give evidence was Geoffrey Court, who lived in Pine Grove. He's given the testimony from a video link which is the second time this method had been used during this trial. In response to the question from the prosecution, Patrick Harrington QC, he tells the court on the night in question he heard shouting coming from what seemed to be the street behind his house. A short time later, a man, the defendant Tom Carney, knocked on his door. Mr. Court says the man was panicking and asking him if he could do a favour and call his father to come and pick him up. He says he called his wife and called the number the man given him and then handed the phone over to him to use. The witness said, "You could see something was wrong. He was sweating uptight and I thought there might have been a gang chasing him." The court says the caller was unable to describe to his father where he was, so he took the handset back and gave directions himself. He says the man then walked off. Witness Jeffrey Court is now being cross-examined by David Ellis QC for the defence. The barrister asked him to confirm that Carney told him that he had been raped or somebody had tried to rape him. The witness said the caller had said something to that effect, but he could not remember the exact words used. The barrister asked him to confirm that when Carney was on the phone to his father, he had repeated the rape allegation to him. Again, the witness agrees, but saying he cannot remember the exact words used. Mr. Court says he was mumbling away to his father, somebody raped him or something to that effect. That concludes his evidence. The next evidence is from George and Mary Downey, who live in Pine Grove. The evidence is in form of a written statement being read by the juror prosecution counsel Ian Wright. In the statements, the couple describe how they were watching the darts on Sky in the evening question when they heard somebody repeatedly banging on their front door. They say that the man was shouting, "Let me in, I won't hurt you." There's a man who tried to SHAG me up the ARSE. The couple say they decided not to open the door, but Miss Downey spoke to the man from an upstairs window. The caller again asked her to let him in. When he told that he wouldn't be let in and they were calling the police, the caller began swearing at Mrs. Downey before walking off. The couple say shortly after the incident they saw the police vehicles in the area. That concludes the Downey's evidence. In response to the question from Patrick Harrington, QC, the prosecute witness Neil Carter tells the court that he was watching TV on the night of Friday the 14th when he saw somebody pass by his window following a loud bang outside the front door. Mr. Carter says he went to the bay window and could clearly see the man at the door. The witness says he was terrified, absolutely terrified, but my first thought was he had been attacked. He says the caller started shouting, "You've got to help me, it's fucking serious, you've got to help me." He says the caller then ran off. "Fuck you all, you bastards," maybe, something like that. It's been obviously cut out. Witness Neil Carter is now being cross-examined by David Ellis for the defence. The barrister asked the witness to confirm that in his statement to police he described the look on the caller's face of one of terror. Mr. Carter agrees. The barrister asks the witness to confirm that Carter shouted, "F you all, you bastards," was directed generally rather than at him. Mr. Carter agrees. The witness says no time did he feel threatened by the caller to his home, and he believed the man had either been attacked or being chased people who wanted to attack him. Witness to give evidence is another person from the Neath area. Because he is under 18, he won't be naming him. The teenager tells the court that when he left his home to go to the shops, he heard a man shouting at his neighbour's house. He says he called his uncle and brother because they were concerned about their elderly neighbour. They got into his uncle's car and followed the man who had been shouting as he was walking away. He says the man, defendant Tom Carney, later approached the car. He seemed quite upset. The witness is now being cross-examined by the defendant, David Ellis QC. He asked the witness what the man had been shouting to his neighbour, and the teenager says he can't remember. The barrister takes the witness to the police statement in which he said the man mentioned something about rape. The witness agreed. The next witness to give evidence is Pinegrove resident Neil Sullivan. He tells the court that at 9:25 p.m. on the night in question, he was leaving for a night shift when he saw neighbour Jeffrey Court talking to a man he recognised from work, Tom Carney. He says Carney is a massive bodybuilder and very distinctive looking and easily recognisable. He says, though he didn't know Carney personally, remembered him from the factory canteen where Carney was always very loud and very confident and involved in banter about girls, fights and alcohol, general rugby banter, he says. The witness says that the last time he seen Carney prior to the night was 2 years earlier when he witnessed the defendant stumble out of the Poundland shop in Neath Town Centre and falling over the pavement. On the occasion, his eyes were rolling. They were bottles of ladies' perfume spilling out of the carrier bag he was carrying, and he was chomping down on biscuits. The most of the biscuits were falling from his mouth on the floor. Mr. Sullivan says on the night of February 14th, 2019, he saw Carney in the street. He says the defendant was waving his arms around, was standing by my Mercedes car containing 3 people. Mr. Sullivan says he advised his neighbour to avoid contact and says he's assumed Carney and the car were somehow connected and the incident was possibly drug-related. Witness Neil Sullivan is now being cross-examined by David Ellis QC. The barrister asked the witness to confirm on previous occasions he had saw Carney in Neath Town Centre. The defendant was on the floor, his eyes were rolling in the back of his head and he was trying but failing to eat biscuits. The witness agreed. Mr. Ellis asked the witness whether Carney had lost muscle mass from where he used to be. Mr. Sullivan says Carney had lost loads of muscle. This concludes Mr. Sullivan's evidence of this morning. Hearing the trial will resume at 2 p.m. The next witness to give evidence is South Wales Police PC Donald Bear, a respondent officer based in the Neath Police Station. He was one of the officers called to report of an assault in a flat in Lime Grove. In response to the question from Patrick Harrington, the defence, he tells the court that when he arrived on the scene, he was approached by a man now known to be Raymond Jones, who directed him to the nearby Pine Grove. An officer says that he got to Pine Grove, he saw a pair of feet poking through the garden gate and someone laying behind the wall. He says Carney, was clutching a can of lager and was very frightened. He looked in shock. My first thought that he was trying not to be a threat to him. The court is now being played. The footage which we saw earlier on saw that PC speaking to Carney and lifting him to his feet. The defendant literally tells the officer his name. The defendant can be heard repeatedly shouting, "He was trying to rape me, he was trying to rape me, he tried to suck my blah." Carney later says he punched him, Mr. Phillips, and asked how he was. The footage shows the defendant being placed into the cage in the back of the paddy wagon. The officer checked the condition of Mr. Phillips on his radio and is told he is dead. He then tells the defendant he's going to arrest him on suspicion of murder. The officer, the gentleman, has died. You've killed him. I've got to lock you up on suspicion of murder. The next body cam clip shows Carney in the back of the van at Swansea Central Police Station. Carney refusing to leave the van and demanding a cigarette. The defendant began a tirade of abuse directed at the officers, threatened to smack them and effing strangle them to death. Carney is also heard shouting, "I got effing raped earlier and you are fucking standing up for him. He's trying to rape me and I am straight as fuck." Next clip shows Carney inside the custody suite at Swansea Central, where he is swearing and shouting at the officers and struggling with the police who are trying to put him in a cell. An alarm sounds at the police station and more officers arrive to assist. PC Bear is now being cross-examined by David Ellis QC for the defendant. The barrister asked the officer to confirm during the van journey from Neath to Swansea Central Station, Carney repeatedly claimed that he had been raped. The officer agrees. The court also hears that the statement from the colleagues of PC Bear recorded Carney as saying he had been at an AA meeting and relapsed. Instead, he tried to rape me. I am effing straight and I feel like a woman. The next witness to give evidence is the Sergeant Ian Howells. He was the custody sergeant at Swansea Police Station on the night in question. The custody sergeant was responsible for authorising a defendant's detention and ensure his welfare. Before he gives evidence in the witness box is cleaned for the coronavirus measurements. Hallow's sergeant says that Carney arrived in an agitated state and became aggressive at the custody desk. He says the defendant was shouting, "He tried to rape me." The officer says Carney became increasingly violent before spitting in my face. The spittle hit me in the eye. The defendant was then taken to the floor and restrained. Yeah, it's not the best move to try and freaking spit in the custody sergeant's face. They don't take kindly to that shit. The defendant refuses to cooperate in police custody. The jury is now being shown a piece of body cam footage which shows Carney in his cell at Swansea Central as a doctor asks him if he can place plastic coverings over his hands to preserve any forensic evidence. Carney refuses to cooperate and again repeatedly claims Mr. Phillips tried to rape him, demanding food and subjecting officers to a volley of abuse. He says, "I asked you for support and you won't give me a microwave meal and a cup of coffee or hot chocolate." He continues, "Kill me if you want. I had a fucking guts full of you. I will cooperate if you give me a meal and a hot chocolate." Another clip shows the defendant still in his cell calling police officers rats and scumbags. That's rich coming from you, but I digress. And saying they are sticking up for a perpetrator. I do get where he's coming from on this though, but two wrongs again don't make a damn right. Do you know what I'm saying? I still don't know how I feel about this case. "He tried raping me. It was the worst experience of my life." The final video clip being played to the jury is from a later at the same night. It shows Carney in his cell talking to an officer. Officers standing outside. Carney began by asking about being charged. The officer tells him that he don't know. He can be heard saying, "He tried raping me. It was the worst experience of my life. I'm still traumatized, and everyone else that don't put up with it." I don't know. I think if that actually happened, it's who you believe, isn't it? Do you believe the defendant or do you believe the prosecution? And then it's, his size and age and fitness, it was complete overkill. I don't know. I still don't know how I'm feeling about it. That concludes today's evidence. Jury prosecution. Barrister Ian Wright explains to the jury that due to COVID rules, they will only allowed to have 2 witnesses in the court building at any one time, so are having to stagger the appearances of witnesses. The jury is adjourned until Thursday morning, when the jury will hear more about the defendant's time in custody in Swansea Central Police Station, as well as the pathology evidence in this case. Defendant spat in the face of the police sergeant. The judge, the jury and the barristers are all in court. The trial resumes. The first person to give evidence is South Wales Police Sergeant Graham Pennock. He was on duty as a custody sergeant in Swansea Central Station when Carney was brought in. His response to questions from prosecution barrister Ian Wright, he described Carney as a large, athletically built gentleman and says that he was shouting and struggling violently. He says he was very difficult to contain because of his strength. The officers tell the jury that he saw Carney spit in his colleague's face, Sergeant Ian Howells, and was later injured as he and his colleague tried to restrain the defendant. Under cross-examination from defence barrister, the officer confirmed that he believed Carney was under the influence of drink and drugs, on the time of the disturbance in the station. That concludes the officer's evidence. He's a big chap in a small room. He filled it in more than one ways. The next witness to give evidence is forensic medical examiner Robert Llewellyn, and examined Carney when he was in custody on February the 15th, the day after the killing. He tells the court his role is to assess whether the defendant is fit to be detained, interviewed, and prepare a body map of any injuries and take samples, intimate and non-intimate, in cases of sexual contact. The medic tells the court he knew Carney had been arrested on suspicion of murder and that he alleged that he had been raped. He says Carney had brought to the medical room in Swansea Central at about 2 p.m. for the examination. His first impression was he was a big chap in a small room and he filled it in more ways than one. Witness, he's very anxious, but he was well behaved and polite to me. My first impression that seemed quite well. The doctor says Carney was coherent and sober and answered his questions appropriately. Carney consumed 60 units of alcohol a day. Jesus Christ. The witness, Carney, disclosed a history of emotionally unstable personality disorder and said he had been on a number of psychotic episodes in the preceding 12 months. He says Carney told him about the prescription medication he was on and also consumed up to 60 units of alcohol a day, the equivalent of 1.5 litres of vodka, 6 bottles of wine, or 30 pints of beer. Jesus Christ. Smoking 40 cigarettes a day and was a regular user of cannabis. He says Carney also said he was an infrequent user of amphetamines, cocaine and heroin. The witness says he assessed Carney and suffered with mild alcohol withdrawal and gave him a Valium to treat it. Mr. Llewellyn says he assessed Carney as being fit to be detained and interviewed. Now, that's slightly confusing. If he was, in fact, that had a 60 units, as they said, that's, let's go back. So that's basically 6 bottles of wine a day. He's going to have more than mild alcohol withdrawals, don't you think? Maybe they'll get more into that later in, but that's slightly confusing to me. Carney told the doctor he was offered sexual favours in exchange for alcohol. The witness says Carney told him, Mr. Phillips had raped me and but after further questioning, he came to the conclusion that only sexual contact between the men had been Mr. Phillips performing fellatio on Carney, and this information guided to what samples he took from the defendant. The doctor says he took swabs from Carney's penis from under the thumbnails and took samples of his pubic hair and head hair. He says he then did body map of any injuries on the defendant's body. He says Carney told Mr. Phillips he'd sent him for a taxi to come to his home in order for alcohol in exchange for sexual favours. He says Mr. Carney said he did not want to, but he needed the alcohol. Now that would make a little bit more sense to me with the size of him and all of that kind of thing. I don't know. I'm still not sure on either. Carney's doctor is cross-examined by the defence. Mr. Llewellyn is now being cross-examined by the defence barrister, Mr. Ellis. The witness says when he returned to Swansea Central the morning of the February 16th as part of his normal duties, he saw Carney again and then was unexpectedly asked by officers to give statements about what Carney had told him the day before. The medic says he was concerned about being asked to do so, as he had seen Carney as a doctor and what he had been said during their meeting had been said in confidence. He says he consulted with the Medical Defence Union and then gave a statement to the officers. Under questioning Mr. Ellis, the witness confirmed that he made a contemptuous note about what the defendant said during the consultation, as the conversation was purely intended to guide him in deciding on what samples to take. He confirms that the first time the account the defendant had given him was written down in a police statement on the 16th. Medic is now being re-examined by the lead prosecution barrister, Patrick Harrington QC. The witness tells him that during the consultation he questioned Carney about whether Mr. Phillips had touched him in his butt with his fingers, tongue or penis, and Carney had said no, but did repeat the phrase, "He tried to rape me," a number of times. He says that he questioned Carney. He had been satisfied that the only sex contact between the man was Mr. Phillips performing oral sex on the defendant. Barrister, had he, Carney, said anything about interference in the anus by fingers or tongue or other means? Could have been taken swabs accordingly. Yes. Did he make such allegations? No. This concludes Mr. Llewellyn's evidence. The next witness was a forensic paramedic, Andrew Vaughan. He assessed Carney in Swansea Central Station in the evening of February 16th. The paramedic says two men chatted about rugby and other matters, and he found him to be calm, compliant, well-spoken, well-mannered, and he came to the conclusion the defendant was fit to be detained. He added, "I would say he was a gentleman." That concludes this morning's evidence. The court is adjourned for lunch. Case resumes after lunch. The court is reassembled after the lunch break and will resume shortly. The first evidence being put before the jury this afternoon is from Deborah Poole. In February 2019, she was a senior healthcare practitioner with South Wales Police and saw Carney on the morning of the 17th to assess whether he was fit to be interviewed. Defendant prescribed medication for anxiety and depression. The witness, a former nurse of Morriston A&E, tells the court that when she assessed Carney at around 7:45 a.m, she found him to be calm and compliant, and that there was no evidence of any acute medical health problems at that point. She says she saw him again at 6:25 p.m. that evening and found him calm and cheerier than I would have expected. Patrick Harrington, QC for the prosecution. There is no abnormal mental health concerns. Witness, nothing at all. The witness is now being cross-examined by David Ellis for the defence. In response to your question, the nurse confirms that Carney told her that he was being subscribed medication for anxiety and depression and told him about his drug misuse. He said his consumption of alcohol had increased significantly in recent years. That concludes the witness's evidence. The court is now moving on to the pathology evidence in this case. The jury is being shown 3 short videos of 3D reconstruction of Mr. Phillips's skull, neck, torso, in which were created following a CT scan of the deceased body at the University Hospital in Wales in Cardiff on February the 16th. The next witness to give evidence will be Richard Jones, a Home Office forensic pathologist based at the Wales Institute of Forensic Medical at Cardiff University School of Medicine. Jesus Christ, that was a mouthful. He tells the court that when he went to Mr. Phillips's flat on the afternoon of February the 15th, he spent 4 hours at the scene. He says he saw the body of the deceased laying on the floor and noted his head was grossly distorted and that the distortion was due to facial distortion rather than top of the head. He says the left side of the face was flattened. He says blunt force trauma injuries were concentrated on or about the victim's face, neck and trunk. A distribution of the injuries most in keeping of the assault. The doctor added that he found 3 teeth at the scene, one under Mr. Phillips's head and another 2 on the carpet nearby. The witness says that the scan showed that had been affected had been shattered the facial bones, meaning the face had lost its integrity, and it would have caused uncontrollable bleeding into the airways, which would have left unable to breathe. He says that the right side of the hyoid bone at the back of his neck had been completely broken and pierced the surrounding tissue, and also damaged the structure of the front of the neck around the Adam's apple and voice box, which would have inhibited him breathing. The pathologist also described the injury he observed to the chest area, Mr. Phillips saying the breastbone was fractured quite severely. He mentioned 4 small square-shaped fractures on his chest, says it upturned stool, oh my God, with a square legs found in the flat was the size of the injuries and could not exclude the stool as being the cause. Victim had 27 separate rib fractures. The pathologist tells the jury he had 27 fractures, 7 of which, due to the lack of bleeding associated with them, he thought was caused more likely by doing CPR chest compressions. He says the other 20 were more than likely caused by trauma inflicted during life. The witness says that he was bruised to the genitals and pelvic area, patterns of which suggested focus, blunt impact, or impact to the genitals. He says that there were such as grazes to the arms, legs. They were quite minor compared to the other injuries. The witness says that they were all fractures of the spine, roughly at the level between the shoulder blade, but how the fractures was caused is less certain, other than it was caused by blunt impact. He says the jury should have been caused by impact to the back or by the chest. Pathology finishes giving his evidence and says that Mr. Phillips died of blunt force trauma. Dr. Jones says after the reviewing of all the pathologist's findings, his conclusion is that Mr. Phillips died because of the blunt force injuries to the head, neck and chest. Defense barrister David Ellis, QC, says he has no questions for the witness in cross-examination, and that concludes today's evidence. Carney tells the court he grew up with two older sisters, attended Comtow School, and had two great parents, John and Lynn. He said he played rugby for Trebois and Ospreys youth team and wanted a career as a professional rugby player. He said he took qualifications in bricklaying after school, so he had a trade to fall back on. Carney also says he likes playing golf, rugby, football, and is a keen swimmer and runner. Carney says the first time he drank alcohol was at his 18th birthday, at an 18th birthday party when he was aged 11. He says he instantly liked alcohol as it gave him release and made him feel so relaxed. At the party, he drank so much he threw up, and his dad's had to put him in the shower. Carney was an alcoholic from the start and learned that the AA is a genetic disorder I was born with. He says as a teenager he can drink cans in the local park and drank after rugby matches. Carney says his drinking took off like going off a ski jump. He says it's still working and training hard as a rugby whilst drinking in excess. The court hears Carney was diagnosed with alcohol dependency syndrome and was prescribed medication. He says he would experience blackouts, some lasting a week. By the age of 24, he also experienced fits. Jesus Christ. He says he could not understand why somebody with a good future ahead of him was drinking so much that he was powerless in the face of alcohol. Carney says one drink is too many, 100 or 1,000 is not enough. Defendant was sectioned 5 times in 8 months. In response to questions from Mr. Ellis, Carney tells the court about his mental health problems with including manic depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, paranoia, and an emotional unstable personality disorder. He says he began dabbling in drugs as well as alcohol and found that drug, Meow Meow, which hit like an atomic bomb. It was more powerful than alcohol. Jesus. He says during the 2018 he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act 5 times in 8 months after hearing voices and thought the curtains in the flat were talking to him. He says on one occasion that he thought people were trying to kill him and jumped out of the window of his flat. Carney tells the court that in January 2019 he had to go to a place in a group therapy with the Welsh Addiction Charity and was part of the contract with them. He community attended 3 AA sessions a week. The witness says at the AA meeting in Neath that he first met David Phillips. Carney described how Mr. Phillips was dressed in a suit and talking in a posh voice. He was a gentleman. He says that during the meetings he said he was looking for a sponsor, and after the session Mr. Phillips approached him and offered to carry out that role. Carney says he was chuffed because Mr. Phillips looked like a perfect sponsor. The defendant says he gave the older man his mobile number. Mr. Phillips was very religious. Carney says Mr. Phillips began calling him regularly, something you wouldn't expect from a sponsor. He talked to him a lot about religion and about Jesus and being the perfect man. He says Mr. Phillips told him that he had been sober for 10 years. He says Mr. Phillips asked him about his past and it was obvious his sponsor was a very religious man. The defendant tells the court that at the end of January, the month of sobriety, he relapsed. It began with cannabis, spliff, and then he started drinking again. Worse than before. He says that he wanted to kill himself, and after researching various methods, decided to take a heroin overdose. He says he went to Neath and bought £100 of heroin after sharing some with other people, and he went to his flat in Morriston and took the remainder. Carney says he passed out but later came to. I was gutted that I woke up. What a mess. I wanted to die. The court is now hearing details of days running up to the event of the 14th of February. Carney says he met a woman on a dating site, Plenty of Fish, and they had a couple of dates in Swansea, including going for a walk around the Mumbles and having Joe's ice cream. He says they spent the night of the 13th together at his Morriston flat drinking wine and cider, and then brought her to a nearby little supermarket. The witness says the couple had sex the following morning and the woman left for work. He says he felt terrible and spent the day laying on the sofa wrapped in a blanket. He says Mr. Phillips called him around 7 p.m. that evening. Secret stash of alcohol. Carney says Mr. Phillips was concerned about his relapse and offered to help. He says Mr. Phillips said that he should not be alone in this state, and he was in. He offered his flat as a safe place that he could stay. He says Mr. Phillips told him that he had a secret stash of alcohol hidden in the shed, and he would use it to wean me off alcohol by giving me small amounts. Carney, he was really worried about me. He emphasized his place was a safe place. People die on their own from alcohol. Did you believe him when he said that? Of course. Carney says he took a taxi to Mr. Phillips's flat. He added, I had high hopes. He'd been sober for 10 years. I had high hopes. Defendant says Mr. Phillips tried to entice him into the bedroom with vodka. He says he challenged Mr. Phillips about whether he had had a drink, and the other man confirmed in a quote-unquote gay voice that he had, because he was upset about the relapse. The defendant said he asked Mr. Phillips for alcohol and was given an already open can of Carlin to drink. He says Mr. Phillips tried to entice him into the bedroom with vodka. Carney says by now it was obvious Mr. Phillips was gay and that he was following around the flat, commenting on his hair, invading his first personal space and touching him. It wasn't nice. He says he went into the bedroom and Mr. Phillips began tipping the vodka into his mouth and feeding him from the bottle. Mr. Ellis, how were you feeling? Carney, I was dying. He dragged me all the way there and he was drinking. I knew by then there was no help for me as he was drinking. Carney tells the court he started feeling extremely drowsy and his limbs felt heavy. He says he laid on the bed as he was in no fit state to go home. He had no money for a taxi. He says he passed out, and when he came around, he found his trousers and boxer shorts had been pulled down and Mr. Phillips was performing oral sex on him. He says there was a strong smell of poo in the room and it was absolutely yumming. Carney says at the first he froze and he was traumatized. He says he tried to get the man off him and called him a dirty bastard. Carney says his limbs were very heavy and his equilibrium was all over the place. The witness says Mr. Phillips asked him to penetrate him and he described Mr. Phillips as being like a sex maniac. So, that's possible, isn't it? That with what we already know about Mr. Phillips, that sounds completely plausible. Not saying what this guy did it was right, but it does sound plausible. But then if he was that his feet and heavy and he could hardly stand up, he's certainly got enough strength to batter the shit out of him. See, still 50-50. I blacked out. I was traumatized. Mr. Ellis, what happened then? Carney, I was petrified. I knew I was in trouble. I knew he wasn't going to stop. I was so afraid. I blacked out. I was traumatized. Barrister, do you remember attacking David Phillips? Defendant, no. Barrister, do you remember picking up items of furniture and a stereo? No. Barrister, do you remember... Oh, sorry, I read that one. Do you remember being outside of the flat and smashing through the door? No. Do you remember anyone else coming into the flat where they were? No, I was out of it. See, I don't know. This is just too much. I'm glad I'm not a jury on this one, just as an FYI, because this one's super hard for me. That's not what I'm like at all. Mr. Ellis asked Carney if he could explain how the mobile phone, which had been in his left pocket of his jogger bottoms, came out and be found under the pillow of Mr. Phillips's bed. Carney says no. Carney then says he was struggling massively to get away from Mr. Phillips and to seek help. He tells the court he cannot remember speaking to people on the street outside the flat, but says it was sad that the neighbours wouldn't open their doors when he asked for help. Huh? He just said he couldn't remember, but then he remembers them not helping. The barrister now takes Carney through his behaviour in Swansea Central Police Station after his arrest, when he was shouting and swearing at officers and fighting with them. Carney says he was out of it and talking absolute crap to the officers. I can't apologise enough to the police. I'm ashamed of it. That's not what I am like at all. This concludes Carney's evidence in chief. Next will be cross-examined by the prosecution. Cross-examination from Patrick Harrington QC. Patrick Harrington QC, lead prosecution barrister, you have pleaded guilty to killing Mr. Phillips, haven't you? Carney, I was advised to plead guilty of manslaughter. Barrister, that's because you are guilty of manslaughter. I don't understand the law. Barrister, do you agree that you have pleaded guilty to manslaughter? Carney, I was advised. Barrister, no, that is not the question. Do you agree that you have pleaded guilty to manslaughter? Carney, yes. Do you agree it's that because you killed Mr. Phillips? Carney, I don't know. Judge Paul Thomas QC asked the witness who he thinks he killed. If he thinks he killed Mr. Phillips. Carney replied, more than likely me, as there was nobody else in the flat. Well, you're a fucking genius. Barrister, do you accept that you killed David Phillips? Carney, I have to. Who else was in there? My clothes were covered in blood. Patrick Harrington QC, you stomped on his head many times. Prosecution barrister, do you agree that it was you that went to the flat and when you came out he was dead? Carney, he died without any intention from me. I've lost control. I can't budge from that. Barrister, I just want the truth. You tell me the truth, Mr. Carney. Do you accept you killed Mr. Phillips? Carney, I pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Have you seen my statements? Barrister, you stomped on his head many times. Carney, I don't know. Barrister, do you remember making a focused attack on kicking him in the genitals? Carney, I don't remember. Barrister, do you remember beating him with a heavy stereo system? Do you remember beating him with a stool? Do you accept that you did these things? Carney, no. Well, how can I accept it if I can't remember? Mr. Harrington, you could have walked away. Mr. Harrington, When you went to the flat, you knew it was for sexual favours. Carney, absolutely no. No way. Barrister, you wanted drink? Witness, an alcohol will always choose to have a drink, but Mr. Phillips was my sponsor and he was to wean me off alcohol. It was in charge of that. I trusted him. Barrister, you could have walked away. Witness, I wasn't in my right mind. Barrister, your limbs were too heavy for you to smash your way in. Your limbs weren't too heavy for you to jump up and down on his head as he lay on the floor. I don't know. Barrister, you were faced with a choice of going away and going back to the house. Yes, I don't know if what choices I faced. I wasn't in control. This is what I said earlier. If his limbs were that heavy that he genuinely couldn't walk, but he did a serious damage, 27 rib fractures, 20 were made by him. That's not somebody who can't walk. I don't know. Mr. Harrington, did he, Mr. Phillips, try to rape you? By this I mean press his pee-pee inside your bum. Carney, I strongly believe it because I could smell poop. The witness tells the court that while at Swansea Police Station, officers told him that Mr. Phillips was a sex offender. Carney, I'm certain that he raped me. Do you accept that you killed David Phillips? Carney, with no exception, yes. The witness added he thinks it was good of him to plead guilty to manslaughter, given that he can't control what happened in the flat, adding that he was more than fair. What? Are you seriously saying that was good of you to plead manslaughter? This concludes this morning's evidence, and the trial will resume at 2:10 p.m. That's crazy. He actually thinks that he's being fair by pleading to manslaughter. Okay. This is getting more and more freaky by the day. Are you forgetting what suits you, Mr. Carney? The trial is resuming after lunch. The defendant will continue to give evidence from the witness box. Prosecution Barrister Patrick Harrington QC is reminding Carey about what he said to the police officers in Swansea Central. Carney was recorded saying he tried to rape me up the bum. I stamped on his head every effing time for spitting in the officer's face. Barrister, do you remember saying that? Do you remember spitting in the officer's face? Carney, I don't remember. Barrister, are you forgetting what suits you, Mr. Carney? Carney, I have been drugged, raped. I don't know what the heck I was saying. Carney says he's embarrassed and ashamed about the way he behaved towards the officers. This is not the type of person I am. You went there through choice. Mr. Harrington, you went to his house through choice, didn't you? You could have said no, but you said yes. Carney, there was a plan. He said he wouldn't forgive himself if something happened to me. I trusted that man. He totally abused my trust. Barrister, you went there through choice. Carney, I went there to get well for court. Carney has an upcoming hearing at Swansea Magistrates Court for an unrelated matter. I had to sort myself out. Barrister, how did you plan to get home that night? Or had you planned to stay with him? Carney says the plan was to spend a couple of days being weaned off alcohol by Mr. Phillips and thought he was going to sleep on the couch. He was a sex maniac. Barrister, the last thing you remember is coming around finding David Phillips performing fellatio on you. Carney, yes, and I could smell poop. The defendant says that he was a wreck and he had gotten into a state very quickly. Something he says was suspicious. Barrister, You were 6'3" tall. You could easily have swatted him away. The defendant says Mr. Phillips gave him drugs. Barrister, are you saying he was a match for you physically? I am saying he was a sex maniac and he was enjoying what he was doing and didn't care that I wanted no part of it. The defendant tells the court that while he was being held in custody at Swansea Police Station, the doctor failed to take anal swabs like he would have done if it had been a woman, making a similar complaint about being raped. It's a fair thing, but he also did say to the doctor that he hadn't, so can't blame the doctor. Carney says he froze during the assault. Carney tells the court he froze during the sexual assault by Mr. Phillips and thought the man was going to bite his penis. He says the taxi to the house was a taxi to hell. Mr. Harrington, after coming around in the flat, you blacked out. You can't remember nothing until you woke up in the police station. Carney, nothing good has come from that day, has it? The conclusion concludes today's evidence. The trial will resume tomorrow at 10:15 a.m. First witness, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Nguyen. I'm going to so butcher that name, so I'm not even going to try. The first witness to give evidence today is the psychiatrist, Dr. Nguyen, who interviewed and assessed Carney in August 2019 on behalf of the defence. The court hears he was asked to assess whether Carney was suffering with alcohol dependence syndrome and whether the syndrome had led to abnormalities of mental functions. He says Carney told him that he started drinking at the age of around 12 and was an alcoholic from day one. By the age of 15, he was drinking 24 cans of alcohol every weekend in the local park. He says by the age of 19, Carney was told him that he was drinking 24 cans per day along with a few bottles of vodka and 6 or 7 flagons of cider. Psychotic episode. The court hears that there are frequent mentions of the problem with alcohol throughout Kane's medical history and references to the need for specialist treatment. Carney had been formally diagnosed with alcohol and substance dependency in 2016, but by the time his status was abstinence, he had previously been diagnosed with an emotional unstable personality disorder. The court hears that in August 2018, the defendant was hospitalized for 3 days with a drug-induced psychosis and extremely paranoid behavior. Carney told medics that he had been taking amphetamines and drinking 9 liters of cider daily. Carney was hospitalized again in October of the same year with amphetamines, cannabis and cocaine-induced psychotic episode. 30 pints of beer or cider a day. The court hears that in November 2018, Carney was admitted to an acute ward in Morriston Hospital after presenting with alcohol withdrawal. The doctor says alcohol withdrawal is treated as a medical emergency because of the physical effects it has on the body. He says Carney disclosed to the medics in hospital that he had been drinking 30 pints of beer or cider daily for the last decade. Conversation with the doctor. Doctor is now telling the jury about what Carney told him about how he met Mr. Phillips and the Alcohol Anonymous meeting and how Mr. Phillips became his AA sponsor. He said Carney told him Mr. Phillips would often call him on the phone. Sometimes that was a bit strange for a sponsor, but would make comments about things like his hair. He says Carney told him that he had been in a low mood throughout the second half of 2018 into 2019. The witness says when he asked Carney about the event on February 14th, the defendant replied, it's really upsetting that somebody has died. I trusted that man. He behaved quite unfairly towards me. I don't understand why someone would do that to me. It's really sad. It's really scary. It's the worst time of my life, and it doesn't feel real. Dysfunctional coping strategy. Doctor says that he took into account the full extent of Carney's medical history, as well as a result of his detailed mental health examination at the defendant. There is, in very opinion, a very clear diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder followed of a childhood trauma. He says Carney's account of heavy drinking from an age suggests he turned to alcohol as a dysfunctional coping strategy. Witness says it is significant that a very numerous references throughout Carney's medical history to different clinical diagnosis, depressive condition. Doctor says he's diagnosed Carney as having recurrent depressive disorder, emotionally unstable personality disorder, and alcohol dependency syndrome. Well, that was a bloody mouthful. Likely the lack of memory is genuine. In response to the question from defense barrister David Ellis, QC, about diminished responsibility, the witness says it is, in his opinion, that at the time of the killing, Carney was suffering from severe alcohol dependency syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, emotional unstable personality disorder. He says all conditions would have led to abnormality of the mental function. He says those conditions would not have stopped him from understanding what was happening. However, in my opinion, his post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol dependency would have subsequently impaired his ability to form a rational judgment and the ability to exercise self-control, turning into Carney's lack of memory of the killing. The doctor says that extreme levels of violence seen in this attack, stomping on Mr. Phillips's with both feet, is suggested a huge emotional outpouring at that moment, and it was likely the lack of memory is genuine, although obviously I can't say for certain. Okay, but now I'm sort of want to know, he said that he grew up with two sisters and loving parents, so this guy is saying, the doctor's saying something traumatic happened in his childhood, but stop jumping the gun, Joe. Maybe something will come up in a minute. You keep doing it. Professionally rugby contract. Doctor is now being cross-examined by Patrick Harrington QC for the prosecution. The witness agrees that the level of alcohol consumption reported by Carney was colossal, but says parts of his life, for example work, could have been ordinary. Judge Paul Thomas said that Carney told the court that by the age of 19 earned a Welsh rugby cap and had professional contact with a local rugby side. He asked the witness whether he thought it was likely that the level of drinking the witness described, 2 dozen cans of beer or cider a day plus spirits, would have picked up that sporting context. The doctor says he thinks it would. The barrister asked the witness about Carney's ability to form rational judgments on the time of killing, given the serious diagnosis he made. Barrister, are you saying at the time of that he was not capable of rational judgment? Doctor, in my opinion, his ability to form judgment would have been significantly impaired, that not to see he would have had no capability, but he would have had the capability to form some degree of thought and judgment. Mr. Harrington asked the witness if he was aware that Carney had left the flat on the night of question before returning it to kick his way through the door and killing Mr. Phillips the way the witness says he was not. The witness said he was not. The barrister asked the witness whether, having left the property, Carney would have had choices. The witness agrees. The barrister asked whether the fact the defendant initially left the flat before returning would influence his opinion. Doctor: yes. If something happened and he left the flat, that's important, because if he chose to go back to commit the offence, that shows a degree of thought, and it's not post-traumatic stress, less likely to be a factor. The witness is now being re-examined by David Ellis for the defence. Of course he is. The barrister asked the witness whether he was able to say how long after PTSD has been triggered do the high emotions last. Doctor says the reaction of PTSD is usually short-lived and can momentarily or last a couple of minutes. He says somebody with a very intense reactive nation may take some time to calm down. He says it is difficult to put a figure on it. Could be a few minutes, could be a few hours. Judge Paul Thomas now asked the witness a question. He asked the witness whether the offence could have been a reaction to self-disgust at having agreed to perform a sexual favour, and asked whether the offence could have happened regardless of the underlying mental issue and condition Carney was suffering from. Doctor says yes, clearly yes. The judge asked the witness whether he was, in his opinion, that the fact that Carney initially gave a false name to the police when officers approached him. Doctor replied, there is nothing I can insist with the jury with in relation to that. That concludes the morning's proceedings. The trial will resume this afternoon when the jury will hear further psychiatric evidence. Dr. Philip Joseph will be providing evidence first today. Until recent, David Joseph was a consultant for forensic psychiatrists and had been involved in the judicial process for years, providing psychiatric assessment in criminal cases. He said he mainly did work in homicide cases for the last 20 years, and his work has examined the individual state and mind at the time of the offence. Dr. Joseph said that he made the assumption that Carney would have provided the same information that was provided by the professional Michael Koppelman. Dr. Joseph said he felt during the meeting that Carney satisfied criteria of an alcohol dependency and emotionally unstable in the absence of alcohol. He also noted that Carney suffered with anxiety and depression and had abused a number of drugs. Witness Dr. Philip Joseph prepared a primary report on July 27th, with the appointment scheduled to meet the defendant on August 14th, his first respondent in the back history. The likely defendant was dependent on alcohol at the time of the killing. Witness Dr. Philip Joseph, a consultant forensic psychiatrist, explained the defendant, Tom Carney, had been attending Alcoholics Anonymous leading up to David Phillips' death. He said it was likely Carney was suffering from the recognized medical condition as alcohol dependency at the time of the killing, but added it was not certain what the degree of alcohol had been consumed at that time was. Mr. Carney was not in good physical shape at the time of the killing. Asked about the potential influence of alcohol, witness Dr. Philip Joseph said, "A small granny is going to be far more intoxicated by alcohol than a young, strong male that needs to be taken into account. Mr. Carney was not in good physical shape at the time of the killing, so that needs to be taken into account. Dr. Joseph Carney may not have been significantly intoxicated by alcohol at the time of the killing, at which point the defense of diminished responsibility would not arise. In Mr. Carney's case, there's been no brain damage. During the MRI head scan, he said, it is involuntary intoxication, which is key. Some degree of intoxication may make for violence worse if someone is that way inclined." Yeah, that doesn't... I'm not sure about that. Intoxication can have intensifying feelings of rage, shame, self-disgust. Dr. Joseph explained, but he added, but if the jury felt these feelings were feelings that had arisen in Mr. Carney through his temperament of his attitude, that contributes of alcohol would play lesser role. It would play some role, but not the primary role. He added that it was a balance of probabilities for the jury to consider whether the consumption of alcohol was a contributing factor. Witness Dr. Joseph said, "It seems that Tom Carney could remember what he had done on the night of the killing, given the information that he provided to the police. It has to rule out that he did not know the nature of his conduct," Dr. Joseph said. "In my opinion, the only area where may have impaired his ability to maintain self-control. They need to be assessed by the jury of exactly what happened between Mr. Carney and Mr. Phillips before the killing." Consultant forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Joseph said he did not feel psychiatric evidence could assist as to whether the murderer accused Tom Carney lost control. He said, on the issue of loss of control as to whether it is diminished responsibility, a virtual piece of evidence for the jury is often the sexual encounter with Mr. Phillips. Mr. Carney left the house and then broke back in. That is virtual of self-control. Defendant said he was living no life at all, detailing his conversation with defendant Tom Carney during the meeting. Psychiatrist Dr. Joseph said Carney told him that he was living no life at all. He had lost contact with his 2-year-old daughter in February. His relationship with the child's mother broke down through his alcohol abuse. Carney told Dr. Joseph he moved to supported accommodation in Swansea in April 2018. He maintained contact with his parents and had some contact with his sisters, as they are a close family. We have no close friends as he don't mix well. He spoke about his 2 psychiatric hospital admissions, describing as horrendous, and said his drugs and alcohol use was out of control. His mother had been worried he had been discharged too soon, and when he was discharged, Carney claimed he had no follow-up or help or support. Carney went to the psychiatric service, covered their back after he was arrested, and items were sent to his home address afterwards. Yeah, unfortunately there's so many with mental health. Not that that's an excuse for the Welsh board of mental health, but there are just so many with not enough doctors, not enough hospital beds. It's the same as any physical injury. There's just not enough doctors, there's not enough nurses, there's not enough mental hospitals, there's not enough beds. It is what it is. Witness relays what defendant told him about how the two met. Alleged murderer Tom Carney told psychiatrist Dr. Joseph that he met David Phillips at an AA meeting in Neath 4 or 5 weeks before the pensioner's death. He said Mr. Phillips sat in the meeting but just stared at him. Carney said he opened up over his troubles at the meeting and felt hopeless. He had exchanged numbers. He said in reflection that Mr. Phillips could have fancied him as he went on about his haircut and didn't realise it at the time. And the night in question, he decided to go round to Mr. Phillips's flat, quote-unquote, out of the blue. When he arrived, Mr. Phillips looked like he had been drinking, even though he had previously stated he had been off the alcohol for 10 years. I went in and straight away he tried to entice me into the bedroom, Carney said. Asking why he did not leave, Carney told a doctor, I could not. It was a long way home and I wished and I would have had to sleep rough. What? Yeah, see? Defendant claimed he thought his drink was spiked. Tom Carney told consultant forensic Dr. Joseph, who was giving evidence, he felt something had been slipped into his drink and he had blacked out. He told Dr. Joseph that Mr. Phillips was asking to be penetrated anally and woke up to see his penis exposed. Dr. Joseph said if the jury conclude that Carney is going to go there for sex, it suggests he is the one who is in control. He is not being groomed, as Mr. Carney suggests. It brings back to the question of who was driving the relationship. Dr. Joseph is currently facing cross-examination by David Ellis, who is defending Tom Carney. Mr. Ellis says, prior to the day of the offence, there is no evidence to suggest that Carney would have engaged in homosexual activities, is there? Joseph says no. Joseph has explained his analysing based upon what Tom Carney said to the police at the time that followed David Phillips's death. It is very important that he left and came back in rather than impulsively acting and then leaving. Dr. Joseph said the jury will obviously be thinking, why did he leave when losing the issues of self-control? The conclusion, David Phillips' evidence, the case is now adjourned for lunch. Judge Thomas QC, the jury are now returning to the court. The afternoon proceedings are about to begin. Forensic scientist asked about swabs from defendant. The next witness will be Neil Simpson, a forensic biologist who works as a senior forensic scientist. Mr. Simpson is being questioned about finding swabs taken from the, whatever those words are, defendant Tom Carney's penis. Or maybe down the Jap's eye or something. I don't know. We'll go with that anyway. He was asked about saliva findings and said it was a weak positive but obtained. Mr. Simpson said, it told me that saliva might be present but not conclusive. He added that DNA profile match of the Carney was found among a minor DNA component that matched Mr. Phillips. Small spots of blood were found on the underwear of Carney. How were they found on the underwear? There is no blood on the outside of the pants and actually on the inside of the front of the pants. How did blood get inside on the front but not on the outside? Okay. Tested, witness says. A sampling of Tom Carney's underwear garments was undertaken prior to the DNA testing. The court hears taping were put across the garments which found removed fibre before testing, the court heard. Witness Neil Simpson said it was not possible to conclusively attribute the saliva found on an individual of an isolated basis. In isolation, positive analyzing was present. Attribute to David Phillips in the area in isolation. Mr. Simpson said it is not possible to say where the saliva came from. He said it could have been one or more or both of them or another person. Okay. Scientist asks about oral sex claims. Scientist Neil gave an assessment of the account given by the defendant Tom Carney, describing oral sex during the performing on him by David Phillips. Explained that he would have expected to find scientifically, he said, I would not expect saliva to be transferred from David Phillips' mouth to Tom Carney's ding-dong. The saliva and DNA can be subsequently transferred to the inside of the underwear. The saliva can be detected from using a test for analysing saliva DNA profiling. Oh my good God. Those findings, what I'd expect is if David Phillips was performing on Thomas Carney, transfer his saliva onto his penis, subsequently the inside of his pants. Mr. Simpson said that it was a very strong evidence to suggest that fellatio had recently been performed on Carney by Mr. Phillips. Not able to say if possible oral sex was consensual. Patrick Harrington, QC prosecution, has asked the witness David Simpson about the scientific evidence to suggest alleged murdered victim Phyllis performed on Tom Carney. He could not say if it was consensual or not, or when it was left there, he asked. No, I cannot, Mr. Simmons responded. The findings support the view that Mr. Phillips did perform on Thomas Carney. Mr. Harrington asked whether it could have been consented that it happened. Mr. Simpson said, no, it cannot. I think it could. The judge said, were you aware Mr. Carney had oral intercourse within the last 24 hours? Mr. Phillips died with somebody else. No, I was not, Mr. Simpson responded. Judge said, were you aware he had vaginal intercourse with somebody in the last 24 hours before his death? Mr. Simpson said no. Judge Paul Thomas asked, would it make a difference? Mr. Simpson said, if I took saliva in and isolated, it may do, yes, but the person would have to have had the same DNA profiling as Mr. Phillips. That brings Mr. Simpson's evidence to a close. The next witness will be a Gavin John Coombs. Witness asked a sponsor for defendant. Witness Gavin John Coombs first met defendant Tom Carney in a 12-step meeting. Similar to AA meetings, he described it as a CA meeting, meaning Cocaine Anonymous. Mr. Coombs was asked by Carney to become his sponsor in February 2017. As a sponsor, he would be called on the phone by Carney every day to instill discipline, to see if he was willing to go through the work of the recovery. Mr. Coombs went through the steps with Carney until step 7. Step 4 and 5 were dealing with issues concerning his fears, sexual conduct, resentment, and harm them to others, the court hears. Witness Gavin Coombs explains the program together stopping when Coombs' benefits stopped and he reached out for a drink again, which he was quite hurt about. He had got close to Carney. Speaking as an alcoholic addict, trust, it's a very big thing in my world. If Carney relapses, it's quite bad. Patrick Harrington prosecution is asking Gavin Coombs about the structure of the meeting. People that were cross addicts, drink and drugs, set up their own fellowship, Mr. Coombs said. I met Tom in Swansea. The onus is on the sponsor. I'm there as a neutral party, not to judge, not to guide him, but to guide him through his work. I told him in my house, I had him in my house numerous times and work because I trusted him. Mr. Harrington asked him whether the meetings were at times emotional. Yes, on both sides, Mr. Coombs said. That concludes Mr. Coombs' evidence. Case adjourned until tomorrow. That brings today's evidence to an end, and the case will resume tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Welcome to the coverage of the day of the murder trial. The barrister in the case, Patrick Harrington, QC, the prosecution, David Ellis, QC, the defendant, and in court, and the hearing to resume shortly. David Ellis, QC, for the defense, gets to his feet and says Carney will not be calling any more evidence. The defense case is complete. Judge Paul tells the jury he has the same legal direction for them before they hear the closing. Judge begins direction to the jury. Judge Paul Thomas, QC, tells the jury that they are the judge of the fact of this case. It is for them to decide what evidence they accept and do not accept, what common sense conclusions they draw from the evidence, and decide the credibility of the witnesses. The judge tells the members of the jury that they have 3 valuable qualities to which they bring to the deliberation: life experiences, common sense, and the ability to make assessments about people, which is skills the judge say you use all the time in their day-to-day life. The judge tells them that emotions must play no part of their decision, and making the verdict must be based on evidence heard. 2 possible defenses to murder available in this case. The judge reminds the jury that Tom Carney has already accepted that he unlawfully killed Mr. Phillips by pleading guilty to manslaughter, but prosecution says the defendant is actually guilty of murder. He says there are 2 possibility defenses to the murder in this case: diminished responsibility or loss of control. He tells the members of the jury they don't have to accept the same defense. Judge Thomas outlines the legal meaning of both defenses, and the court is now close to hear closing speeches from the prosecution and the defense. Prosecution Patrick Harrington begins his closing speech telling the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is murder. Thomas Carney deliberately inflicted the most vicious, sustained and brutal attack on his victim, and by doing so in a controlled manner fueled by anger, chose to end another person's life." Continuing with his closing speech, prosecution Patrick Harrington says he, Carney, does not accept the culpability, seeing himself more as a victim than a killer, but he is a killer. He is only admitting to what has been proved anyway. The barrister says Carney's outburst in the flat was driven by anger, revenge and spite. The jury told one of the main questions for them is why Carney went to David Phillips' flat that night in question. What was he expecting to happen when he got there? What did happen is how he did react. Our case is that he went there in exchange for sexual favors for drink. Prosecution Patrick Cameron continues his closing speech, reminding the jury that whatever happened in that flat or whatever sexual contact occurred between the men, Carney left the flat afterwards, and he says Carney, a young man, a former rugby player, a gym goer, was outside the flat and in a safe place when he chose to return, smash his way back into the flat and carry out the fatal attack. He reminds the jury that the fact that Mr. Phillips had suffered focus injuries to the groin, genitals, and it looked pretty certain Carney beat the man to the chest with a wooden stool, as well as hitting him with a stereo and stamping on him. False name, an example of his guilt, his deceit. Prosecution Patrick Harrington QC reminded the jury about how Tom Carney abusive behaviour and language towards the officers when he was arrested. The barrister says the deliberate intention of giving a false name to the officers who found him. He says he was a deliberate lie, yet the court is asking to believe my brain was addled to the time he didn't know he was doing wrong. The barrister added, this is an example of his guilt, his deceit, of him trying to lie his way out of things. Mr. Harrington reminded the jury about Carney's conduct at the police station when officers wanted to place plastic bags on his hands to prevent forensic evidence. He had to respond by complaining he wouldn't be able to pleasure himself while wearing them. There he is, less than an hour after stomping a man to death, complaining that with the bags over his hands, he wouldn't be able to. You can see what that says. Yeah, that's the thing I think of when I've just murdered somebody. Okay. Prosecution says alleged killer has thrown his life away. Prosecution Patrick Harrington says it is accepted the alcohol addiction dependent Tom Carney was suffering from was a curse, and it was beyond his control as an addict. He says in the accusations the defendant has been offered help in his additional. Sometimes taking that help, but sometimes not. He says the fact that Thomas Carney has thrown his life away, thrown his career away as a rugby player, where he could have achieved great things, he has the discomfort of knowing he is the one that might have been. Prosecutor says manslaughter admission does not face the reality of what he has done. Patrick Harrington continues his closing speech to the jury. He says on the day of the killing, Carney is in the flat drinking while he contacted Mr. Phillips, or Mr. Phillips contacted him, and it was arranged that he should go to Mr. Phillips's flat in a taxi paid for by the pensioner. He went there to drink. He went there knowing what was in store. He went there to exchange sexual favors for drink. He had the drink, then changed his mind on the sexual favors. This could have been the end of things, but he went back to the flat. He did these terrible things knowing what he was doing and doing it out of spite to hurt Mr. Phillips and ultimately kill Mr. Phillips. Mr. Harrington described Carney as a person giving a foul temper, a person who is having found sanctuary and safety outside of Mr. Phillips' flat in Lime Grove, decided to return. You came back to the centre event, his decision, his controlled decision to go back into the flat and did what he did. He pleads guilty to manslaughter, but has done so. He does not face the reality of what he has done. The reality is murder, and we submit that this is the conclusion you must come to. Now, see, I think if he did it without going out and coming back, he probably could have done the I lost my shit. But the fact that he went and then came back, I think that's going to be the question and ultimately screw him over. Defence closing speeches begins. Now it is turn of the defence barrister David Ellis QC to deliver his speech to the jury. He tells the jury to put aside any emotions and to try the defendant on the facts. Mr. Ellis says, "There is no getting away from the fact of what happened to Mr. Phillips was brutal. You have heard the pathology, you know what happened, and there is no denying it. It is fair for the prosecution to criticise the defendant, and the prosecution does. That he says that to this day he cannot remember doing it." Barrister David Ellis, defendant, says there is one control issue in the jury to consider. What was the night that made Thomas Carney do something like that, which he has never done before and never done since? What was it that led him to do it? What was him that led him to attack Mr. Phillips in the way that he did? Defendant's barrister refers to the deceased's previous convictions. David Ellis QC, defendants, continues his closing speech. He tells the court about previous convictions of David Phillips from 1999 for assaulting with intent to commit serious sexual assault and indecent assault. This conviction relates to an incident when Mr. Phillips picked up a man in a bar in Swansea, took him home before drugging him, removing his clothes, performing oral sex on him, and attempting to rape him. The barrister said, "Does that ring any bells?" Mr. Ellis says the defence invites the jury to take the facts and convictions into account when considering what the defendant says happened in the flat. He says at the time of the killing, Mr. Phillips also subject to sexual harm, preventing him following a conviction from 2016 involving a 16-year-old boy in Neath. Barrister says the defendant has no idea about Mr. Phillips' previous convictions and asked them to question what Mr. Phillips was doing in AA meetings where he had the defendant met. The meeting is where the deceased would sit back watching on. And then making out then the pensioner and the deceased is putting that victim into your head then, isn't it, when in reality is he a victim? Why was David Phillips so keen to get Thomas Carney to his house? David Ellis QC, defendant, is reminding the jury about the text messages pensioner David Phillips subsequently sent to the defendant Tom Carney after their meeting at an AA group, in which he expressed his concerns about what he is going through. He reminded them that Carney thought it was strange that his new AA sponsor was asking questions about his past. The barrister says the prosecution are saying that Mr. Carney, who was desperate for drink despite no suggestions of any homosexual activities in his past, in fact, quite the contrary, that he agreed to go to Mr. Phillips's flat to give sexual favours to a man in his 70s, a matter for you, ladies and gentlemen. He also reminds the jury of the lengthy phone calls Mr. Phillips made to the defendant on the day in question on February 14th. He says, "Why was David so keen to get Miss Thomas Carney to his house? There may have been clues in that you knew Mr. Phillips had done in his past." Yeah, it's not looking good for the pensioner, is it? Although, again, I'm not saying what he did was right. The fact that he left and came back, I think, shows premeditation. But this pensioner's not innocent either, if that makes sense. Defence barrister says Carney was grabbing for the attention of as many people as he could. David Ellis, QC, defendant, now taking the jury to Tom Carney's behaviour following the killing, he says, if, as the prosecution alleged, the defendant was in control and knew what he had done, why didn't he simply run away? Why did he stay in the area and draw attention to himself? Instead, he went around knocking on doors, calling for help, and practically got every single neighbour out of the house. I agree with that. That's what made me think, like, yeah. The barrister reminds the jury of the evidence that heard from people living in Lime Grove and the neighbouring streets about the frightening and confusing state of Carney. Thomas Carney was grabbing the attention of many as he could. If they consistent with a controlled killer or consistent with an account Tom Carney had been given, you decide. He also reminds the court of the evidence of P.C. Bear, the first officer encountering Carney. He said that he was in shock. This concludes the morning's evidence and our live coverage of the proceedings today. After lunch, Mr. Ellis is due to finish his closing speech before the judge. Thomas QC sums up the case to the jurors, who will then retire to deliberate the verdict. We will be live coverage as the verdict will be returned. Now, see, this is what makes me think something happened in that flat. Something happened. What makes me think it wasn't that he lost his mind because he went back. Okay? I believe that something happened and he pushed himself in some shape or form, drugged him, whatever. I believe that. And I believe he's the victim as well. But what I don't believe is that he didn't know what he was doing because he left and then went back. I think he left, built up that rage of like, how fucking dare you? Like, I am a 6'3" bodybuilder. You're like 5 foot and a fag end of a man. Do you know what I mean? I think that's where the anger then built up inside of him, and then he was like, maybe went into shock again after that. I don't know, but something definitely occurred in that flat, but I don't think either of them are innocent. Verdict is due imminently. Welcome back to our coverage of the trial. The court is reassembling and the verdict is imminent. Tom Carney denies murdering a pensioner, David Phillips, but admits manslaughter. Carney convicted of murder. The foreman of the jury is asked if they have reached a verdict upon which they are all agreed. The verdict is guilty of murder. Carney will be sentenced next week. John Paul Thomas, QC, thanked the members of the jury for their diligent service, especially during the current difficult conditions. He says that there are only one sentence for murder, and that is life in prison, and the only question for him is how long the defendant must serve before he can apply for release. The judge says he will sentence Carney next Thursday. On Thursday, a judge at Swansea Crown Court ordered he spend at least 15 years and 10 days behind bars as he described of the savage, relentless murder. I don't know why the 10 days, but okay. So, that's the end. Wow, 15 years. So, that's the end. I'm still not sure what to think about it, if I'm honest with you. Did he do wrong? Yes. Did something happen in that flat that was untoward? I believe so. The fact that he left and came back, that's a bit for me. But I do believe something, whether it was bribery with alcohol, whether it was he was drugged. Obviously, there's only two people that know. One's dead, one's in jail. But something untoward, I believe, happened. Look at the history of the man who's deceased. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was 15 years too much? Was 15 years accurate? Would you say that he's guilty of murder or manslaughter? There's so many more questions unanswered, but again, let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, ring the bing bong so you get notifications, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye, guys.